If you asked most people when society's rules were rewritten, they'd probably imagine something dramatic. A revolution. A war, a new constitution. A major election. Some visible turning point where everyone knew things had changed. But a lot of the biggest changes in modern society didn't happen that way. They happened quietly, gradually, through lobbying, media influence, tax policy, privatization, and the slow reshaping of what people came to accept as normal. And at the center of much of that process was one group of people, the ultra-wealthy. Not just wealthy people in general, but billionaires and the institutions around them. People with enough money to influence politics, shape public narratives, and redesign systems in ways that most people never notice until the effects are already permanent. So, how did billionaires quietly rewrite the rules of society? Well, to answer that, we first have to understand what money becomes at a certain scale. Now, for most people, money simply buys security. A home, healthcare, education, freedom from constant stress. For millionaires, it buys comfort and status. But at the billionaire level, money becomes something else entirely. Power. Because once you have more wealth than you could ever spend personally, the remaining value of money is not consumption. It's influence. The ability to shape decisions you were never elected to make. The ability to affect lives you'll never directly encounter. The ability to move institutions. And over time, that power can become self-reinforcing. Start with politics. The modern political systems, they're expensive. Campaigns cost money, advertising costs money, consultants cost money, the legal teams cost money. Which means that politicians, well, they often rely on donors. And while millions of small donors can matter, a relatively small number of extremely wealthy individuals can have outsized influence. They fund the campaigns, the political action committees, think tanks, advocacy groups. They support candidates who align with their own interests, and they oppose those who don't. Now, this doesn't always look like corruption in the obvious sense. It often looks legal, professional, even normalized. But the result is the same nonetheless. Policy becomes more responsive to concentrated wealth than to ordinary voters. Then, there's lobbying. Large corporations and wealthy interest groups spend enormous sums influencing legislation and regulation. And not by bribing officials in dark rooms, but by funding research, hiring experts, drafting policy language, and maintaining constant access of decision makers. If lawmakers are overwhelmed, underinformed, or dependent on donor networks, well-funded interests gain an advantage. They help write the rules. Tax policy is one of the clearest examples. Over the past several decades, many countries reduced top marginal tax rates, lowered taxes on capital gains, expanded loopholes, and created complex systems that are easier for the wealthy to navigate than everyone else. The result is that labor income is often taxed differently than wealth growth. If you earn your money through wages, it may be taxed one way, but if wealth grows through stocks, assets, or investment structures, it may be taxed more favorably. That matters because billionaires often don't rely primarily on wages. They rely on assets. So rules that appear neutral on paper can produce very unequal outcomes in practice. Then there's privatization. Public services and public assets were increasingly reframed as inefficient, outdated, or burdensome. Utilities, transportation, healthcare functions, education systems, housing, infrastructure management, many areas once seen as public responsibilities were opened to private profit models. Sometimes this improved efficiency, sometimes it didn't. But one consistent effect was that essential services became new revenue streams. When sectors people depended on are converted into profit opportunities, wealth can extract value from daily life in new ways. Tolls, fees, higher costs, reduced access. And because the shift happens gradually, it can feel normal by the time people fully notice it. Then there's media. Owning media doesn't just mean controlling newspapers or television stations. It can mean funding platforms, advertising ecosystems, entertainment networks, publishing institutions, or the algorithms that determine visibility. Narratives shape politics. They shape what problems seem urgent, what solutions seem realistic, and what ideas feel extreme. If people repeatedly hear that inequality is natural, unions are outdated, regulations kill innovation, and public systems always fail, those ideas can become common sense, even when reality is much more complicated. This is one of the most powerful forms of influence because it doesn't just feel like coercion, it feels like culture. Then there's philanthropy. On the surface, billionaire philanthropy appears unquestionably positive, funding schools, hospitals, research, climate initiatives, poverty programs, and some of it, yes, it absolutely does create real benefits. But philanthropy also changes power dynamics. Because when private individuals can direct billions toward public priorities, they gain influence over decisions that might otherwise be democratic. Which schools get funded, which diseases get researched, which cities receive investment, which policies get pilot programs. That means public priorities can become dependent on private preferences. And unlike governments, philanthropists are not broadly accountable to voters. Then there's labor. Now, as wealth becomes more concentrated, many workers experienced a different reality. Wages stagnated relative to productivity in many sectors. Benefits weakened, job security declined, union power diminished. Meanwhile, executive compensation and shareholder returns grew dramatically. This wasn't inevitable. It reflected choices. Corporate governance models that prioritized shareholder value above all else. Labor laws that became less protective, global systems designed to maximize bargaining leverage for capital over workers. The rules of work changed, and many people experienced the results as stress, precarity, and declining leverage. Then we have housing. As capital searched for returns, housing increasingly became an investment vehicle. Homes became assets first, shelter second. Institutional investors entered markets, speculation intensified in many cities. Land scarcity combined with policy barriers and finalization pushed costs upward. For people trying to buy or rent, housing became harder to access. For those already owning appreciating assets, wealth grew. Same market, very different outcomes. Then of course, there's the ideology behind all of this. Many of these changes were justified through a specific worldview. Markets know best. Government should step back, wealth creators deserve rewards. If the rich get richer, benefits will spread downward. Competition solves most problems. Some markets do allocate resources efficiently, some private innovation is valuable. But turning these ideas into near unquestioned doctrine allow many policy choices to be framed as inevitable rather than political. Tax cuts become growth policy, deregulation became modernization, cuts to public systems became fiscal responsibility. And because the language sounded so technical, the value judgments inside it often went unnoticed. Then there's scale. A billionaire doesn't need to control everything. They only need influence at key pressure points. A few lawmakers, a few regulators, a few media channels, a few strategic acquisitions, a few think tanks producing policy papers, a few court cases, a few election cycles. Over time, small shifts accumulate. Rules around taxation, rules around labor, around mergers, rules around housing and finance. None of them may feel historic in that moment, but together, they reshape society. Quietly. Then something else happens. People adapt. Younger generations grow up inside the new rules and assume they've always existed. Gig work feels normal. Crushing rents feel normal. Healthcare tied to employment feels normal. Student debt feels normal. Massive wealth gaps feel normal. Once a system becomes familiar, it becomes harder to imagine alternatives. And that may be the most effective rewrite of all. Not just changing the rules, changing what people believe the rules can be. Now, this doesn't mean every billionaire personally coordinated some grand plan. Society is a bit more complex than that. Many wealthy people disagree with one another. Some support higher taxes, some fund public causes, some genuinely believe that they're helping. The point is not individual villainy, it's structural power. When enough wealth concentrates in a few hands, those hands gain disproportionate influence over systems. And systems, well, they tend to evolve in favor of those who can shape them. So, what does that mean now? It means many problems often described as unfortunate side effects may actually be predictable outcomes of how rules were written. If housing rewards investors over residents, costs rise. If labor rules weaken workers, bargaining power falls. If tax systems privilege assets over wages, inequality expands. If politics depend on money, policy tilts upward. That doesn't mean change is impossible. Rules were made, rules can be remade. Tax systems, they can be redesigned. Campaign finance can change. Antitrust can be enforced. Labor protections can expand. Public services can be reinvested in. Housing can be treated as shelter instead of just an asset. But none of that starts if people think that the current system is natural. Because it isn't. It was built, adjusted, negotiated, influenced, and often rewritten quietly. That is the real story. Billionaires didn't need to seize power dramatically. They only needed to shape incentives, institutions, and narratives over time. Slow enough that it felt normal, quiet enough that many people barely noticed. Until one day, the rules of society looked very different, and most people were living under rules they never chose.